Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and today I am here with Heather. Thank you for taking the time to be here, Heather.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about Cube.
It's a fun thing to talk about, and what a great thing to bring people together. You have put together a number of different really interesting environments, but today we're going to get to jump in on particularly the Urza Saga cube.
Yeah, this is my first cube that I ever designed. I started it with a friend of mine, Justin, and we put a lot of effort into it, and then it barely resembles the first iteration, as often happens with Cube. This is a cube that I enjoy quite a bit, and people always seem very excited when it comes out, so I'm excited to share it with more people.
Well, I like to ask as we're diving in here, Heather, why cube as a creative outlet for you?
Well, I play a lot of Magic. Historically, I played mostly constructed formats, but in the past couple of years, I was introduced to Cube, and it really made me appreciate the gathering side of Magic quite a bit more than I had previously. And also, it seems just like much more creative than playing constructed, where in constructed, you're often playing these like set matchups that you know like the back of your hand, and it's just about executing better. But in Cube, you get to be more improvisational, I suppose, about your strategies, and you get to define what the format looks like. And I think that leads to a lot more interesting things going on and a lot more variety when you can creatively constrain the space rather than just finding the best thing to do at all times.
I like that turn of phrase, like creatively constraining the space. That's really good. I remember hearing somebody suggest once that building a cube is like building many decks all at once in some way too.
Yeah, you can't just build one deck, you have to add counters to it as well in the pool. Like in Urza Saga Cube, there's like a broad, overarching like artifacts theme, but there's so many different ways that you can interact with artifacts, and they interlock in interesting ways.
Well, yeah, let's get our stage set and we'll dive right in there. How would you give your elevator pitch for the Urza's Saga cube, Heather?
Okay, so Urza Saga Cube is an artifact synergy cube. There are a lot of powerful effects that interact with artifacts in peculiar ways and are just like powerful artifacts in general. You also get one Urza Saga as part of your pool. So it's a normal draft, 360 cards, 8 players. So you'll end up with a 46 card pool. One of those cards is Urza Saga. And you may put it in your deck if you'd like to, but you are not strictly required to play Urza Saga. And what's neat about this environment is you have this very consistent tool in your deck that enables you to get 0 and 1 drop artifacts that can be archetype defining just by themselves. There are cards like Hammer Time or Lantern of Insight or Phyrexian Dreadnought that are very powerful, and when you have more ready access to it in your deck, you're going to be able to do the thing more often. That's something I really like about these games. They tend to be very consistent and very high power just because the tools are high power and highly consistent.
Yeah, a card that says go get like your choice of thing in many cases. Having access to that almost every game has got to be like just turn the whole thing on its head.
Yeah, it's not quite every game though. That's one of the things that I do like about it. It's just another card in your deck. So it makes things more consistent without like starting in play or in the command zone or something like that, which has been suggested to me in the past. And I think when you have access to it on turn 0 of every game, it's a very different beast than just having one in your deck. I think that would lead to the same games playing out over and over again, which is something I like to avoid in Cube.
That's interesting. So like you're aiming for consistency to some degree without redundancy, I suppose.
Right, or guaranteed access.
Sure. So how did you come to this idea? Because most people don't start from like, I just want an environment where Urza Saga is the best or like is the core piece.
So it started as an artifact-centric cube. I just really like that permanent type, and there are a lot of interesting things to do with it. And I just kept thinking, I was building sample decks, and I wanted Urza Saga in every single sample deck. And I thought that it was going to be so good that I would have to cut it from the cube, which seems really bad to do from my mind because like I really like the card. I think other people enjoy playing the card, and it would be a notable exclusion if it wasn't there.
Right. Yeah, like, here's my target card, and then and then if you end up pulling it out, it's
Exactly.
like where's the framework this is built on?
And it just made sense to me to give one to everybody because then there is a central pillar to the format and like everything revolves around it, but it's not just exclusively about that. I didn't want the Urza Saga deck to win the draft every single time, but I wanted that to be part of the environment. So I instead made it so that the Urza Saga deck wins every time and also loses every time.
That's great. You know, you suggested in your overview that you said artifacts maybe a celebration of the most broken card type. Do you still feel that that's true after playing around in this environment?
Um, I think I would revise that a little bit. I think lands are the most broken card type, but artifacts are a close second. And in part, it's because artifacts are very fragile, especially when you put as many shatters in your environment as I do.
Yeah.
There are just a huge number of cards that are essentially 2 mana or less Vindicate, and it makes it very tricky to have a plan that is entirely based on a single artifact. So, yes, they are very powerful, but also fragile. They come with a huge downside.
And I imagine there's a trickiness to threading things like artifact removal with the ability to play around artifacts so much, and also enchantment removal, since that would then engage with Urza Saga.
Yes, I wanted to make sure that the Urza Saga was answerable, just so that you don't end up in situations where one person has the Urza Saga and the other doesn't, and then the Urza Saga just like completely runs over them. Like those kinds of games do happen, but it's not the most common just because there's so much surface area to interact with Urza Saga. Like you can deny the mana by killing it on the stack. You can deny them constructs by killing the Urza Saga before they get the second ability. You can deal with the construct half. You can potentially deny a search, or you can, for instance, proliferate with. There's one card that has proliferate in the cube.
Oh, it's the black removal spell, right?
Drown in Ichor. Yeah,
Yeah.
so if you have an Urza Saga on 2 and you drown in Ichor, you can pump it up to 3 and cause the search to happen immediately, which denies a construct. So it's just, there's a lot of different ways to interact with it. And I think that's a really key part of the card. I wanted to make sure that a friend of mine used this term, use all parts of the Urza Saga Buffalo. I wanted to, I wanted to make sure that all of the different types of games you could have with it were present in the cube.
Have you considered including ways to either increase or decrease the likelihood of drawing the marquee card of the environment?
There are cards like that in there. So there's Crop Rotation and Elvish Reclaimer, Life from the Loam, technically, can draw you towards the Urza Saga. Though it's mostly in green, because I wanted to make sure that green had a unique identity that wasn't just destroy target artifact or enchantment, which
Right.
is how it started. And green was just one of the best colors because of that. I felt like it needed something else to give it some identity. And a sort of lands archetype was, I think, a very good inclusion in the cube. So if you want to be tutoring for Urza Saga, green is your friend.
I think it's really interesting that even in an environment like this, you've described one of the perennial challenges for cube designers, which is here's the cool thing I want the cube to be around, and here are the answers for it. And the deck that is all answers is just a hammer every time.
Yeah, so red and green are the best colors in the cube, or have historically done well, especially with cards like Goblin Welder, which is just arguably
Oh,
way too powerful for the environment, but it just is so emblematic of powerful synergistic artifact strategies that I feel like it's an auto include, despite how good it is. I think there's room for that in cube.
yeah. Well, and you noted it would almost be like a glaring omission in some ways. You're playing with artifacts as a key thing. This little goblin is kind of the core of some of that.
Right. There's also like a goblin's archetype, which is a big deal. So like I have, in rare situations, sacrificed a goblin welder to a goblin trash master, or started attacking with it because I had a Krenko Baron of 10th Street and it just incidentally got very large. So there are other reasons to have it than just the artifact side of things.
Welder being fed to Trashmaster is a strange irony that I can't quite put my finger on.
Yeah, you can get the welder back though. So there are things like pre-war formal wear, recommission, or things like that. The big welder deck tends to be red and white anyway, so you can rebuy it.
So much of this cube hinges on, I imagine, or is really centered around the 0 and 1 mana artifacts. And it has to be literally 0 and 1, right? You can't get
Yes,
your
it can't.
X's.
You can't get engineered explosives or walking ballista or anything like that.
Yeah, as a judge, I got to answer that question many times at tables. But yeah, so like being centered around zeros and ones, what does that look like for the rest of the artifact package? Like, where do you go with that?
So the way that I wanted to think about it is I wanted the zeros and ones to be kind of universally powerful in a lot of situations, or archetype defining, one of those two. And for the rest of the artifacts, I kind of just picked ones that I liked. There are things like Winter Orb and Howling Mine, which people tend to really despise, but I find great joy from having those on the battlefield.
And you have a relic barrier in there, so what's not to love?
There is Relic Barrier. There are plenty of ways to tap them. There's Icy Manipulator, Tangle Wire. I just wanted there to be a lot of iconic artifacts that maybe don't get a lot of space in other cubes. Things like Mystic Forge or Cart Clan Ironworks or Relic Barrier, for instance, don't get a lot of play in other places. And I wanted to make sure there was a home for them here.
Yeah, the themes have to be really loud for those to be like particularly playable in many cases.
Right. Or like Traxos, Scourge of Krug is
Yeah.
a favorite amongst my playgroup. And it's often unplayable in cubes, but here it's merely unplayable.
It's unplayable in principle.
Well, it dies to shatter very easily.
But at least it will die untapped.
Yeah, that's true. One of the things about all of the shatters in the cube is it's a high number, but the number of artifacts is higher. So you have to really choose your spots. You can't just destroy every artifact that enters the battlefield because eventually one is just going to get over the top. So you have to be very particular about what you're removing, or try to remove things through combat if you can. I think that's kind of a core principle of the design.
Do you think of artifact removal kind of like creature removal in a, I hate to say more regular cube, but like in an environment where that's more standard?
Yeah, I think so. They're very similar, and often the artifact removal doubles as creature removal just because of the number of artifact creatures. Even then, the removal count is pretty high in this cube.
It sounds like with the ability to put so many permanents on board, just potentially coming from the land base, right? Like
Right.
you have to have enough answers for that.
Yeah, when everybody has land ancestral recall in their deck, you do need a lot of answers, and generally like 2-for-1 answers are better, but those are few and far between. Typically, those come in the form of like things like untimely malfunction, where you want to redirect your opponent's shatter rather than just things like force of vigor, which are kind of nuts.
Yeah, I was going to say Force of Vigor, kind of the hallmark example of incredibly efficient and incredibly devastating. Maybe that's a good moment to ask then also, you said you wanted Urza Saga to be answerable. It sounds like you've really leaned into the ability to destroy lands or to destroy particularly artifacts and enchantments there on the ground.
Yes,
Was that something that evolved or did you start with that sensibility?
it kind of started that way. I have played a lot of Eternal constructed formats where it's just understood and expected that your lands are going to die, and that just seems like a normal part of Magic. I didn't want
Yeah.
to go as far as like Wasteland Strip Mine, but I do want people to have to pay for having good fixing, right? So the bridges are in the format, which are artifact lands that tap for 2 different colors and they enter the battlefield tapped, and notably, they are indestructible.
Yes.
But there's a lot of ways to kill them still. You can pick your poison target opponent sacrifices an artifact. You can cast into the fire.
Masked Vandal, one of
You
my
can
favorites.
masked vandal. You can natural obsolescence. You can goblin weld an artifact land away.
Oh, that's brutal. I forgot about that.
You can tap it down with a relic barrier or a pacification array. So like there are a lot of ways to interact with the mana, and the fixing is intentionally pretty bad. In part because there's so much of the cube is colorless. So the fixing doesn't need to be as good as it is in a more traditional cube because you're not as constrained on pips in this format.
Yeah, for clarity, almost a literal third of the cube is colorless cards, and not including lands. It's amazing.
Yeah. And partially that was just a lot of those are the zeros and ones for Urza Saga. I wanted to make sure there was a huge variety of things to do at 0 and 1 so that decks didn't always feel like they were doing the same thing, and that your suite of Urza Sagable targets give your deck a distinct like fingerprint or a different flavor than you would normally get. So it often feels very different to play these decks.
How brutal is Pithing Needle here, since you can name your opponent's Urza Saga?
It's pretty brutal, but again, it's an artifact, so you can destroy it if it's really causing problems. I find it fairly rare to name Urza's Saga. Like that's a situation where you're getting it off of Urza's Saga during the chapter 3 ability after you've used it and before your opponent has drawn it. So often it's not going to be that helpful to name Urza's Saga up front, and you would rather name something that's already present. Like say they have a Elvish Reclaimer in play, or a
Sure.
Duretti, or Tameshi, or any number of things that are more urgent than just the Urza Saga. Because like Urza Saga is it's very powerful, but it's also very slow, and this is a format that goes pretty fast.
Yeah, how do you think about speed in this format? Because as you said, something like Urza Saga takes several turns to get rolling, if you even draw it.
If you draw it. So I tend to think that this is a pretty fast format. Games are not over, but I don't want to say that games are decided by turn 4, but it often feels that way. Everything is very low to the ground. There are few 4 drops, few 3 drops, and mostly 2s and 1s. And the more expensive stuff tends to be stuff you might cheat out, like with a trash for treasure or something like that. So it typically you're getting your hand size down pretty low, pretty fast, and playing on the board. And sometimes it's very aggressive and sometimes it's very controlling. But you are playing on the board more than in a lot of formats.
So does it feel like some of your more winning strategies are the ones that just get established that quickly?
Or that have the ability to do powerful things early. So the decks that tend to do well have powerful early plays and then enough resiliency to survive the barrage of shatters. And that can come from like recursion elements or just card advantage through something like a Ichor Wellspring loop or Scrap Trawler or things like that, or Teshar Ancestor's Apostle. Like the decks that
Yeah.
tend to do well establish themselves early in like a strong position and then can fend off the opponent for a long time. But games tend to be pretty board stally as long as you don't just get overrun, which can happen. Like sometimes like an early Colossus Hammer will just end your life, but that's kind of rare.
Well, you suggested with a constructed background. Those are familiar lines that sometimes here's the huge thing that happens, and if you can't stop it right away, occasionally it gets there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have that kind of thing in Cube. I think if everything is always going to go long and slow, it's less interesting. Like you get a lot of variety by having fast decks as well.
Yes, say more about that. I think that's an interesting idea. That like you want there to be at least a fast enough clock to move things along.
I really like it when games of Magic end. And to that end, I put a lot of very powerful cards that can end games on the spot, but they're also like very easily disruptible.
So like it's balanced out by having the interaction to make that not just an instant win button.
Exactly, right? So that's sort of a situation where you need to choose your spot also with the removal. Like there are so many different things that you have to target and threading your way through the army of artifacts is kind of what I want the format to be about. Like choosing your spot wisely and making reasonable combat decisions and things like that. There are also like prison decks in the format too, which is what I usually try to go for. So there's really like a wide range of viable strategies.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned in a couple different ways, Heather, about the power of this environment. Do you think of it as particularly like high power or low power? Like I know Urza Saga particularly high power historically, but there's also some cards here that you would never see in a quote unquote high powered environment.
I would say that it is sort of a medium high power level. And it has certainly been at higher power levels in the past. There was even a version of the cube that I built that had actual power, a vintage inspired version. So when
Sweet.
Urza Saga was restricted in vintage, I kind of wanted to pay an homage to the 4X Urza Saga format, which is one of my favorite vintage formats of all time. And so I built a version of this cube that was trying as much as possible to be like constructed vintage. And that was cool, but it wasn't really that fun for people. I think you have to really want to opt into that sort of thing. And the play group that I play with is not super high on vintage power level cubes in general. So partially the power level decreased for the play group that I play with. And also it's just limited, I think, gets better when there are fewer power spikes or fewer things that just like immediately win the game, but instead present a question like, if you don't answer said permanent, you will die in 4 turns or 3 turns. Like that's much more reasonable than just I played a creature and then my opponent put an Oath of Druids in play and now I lose. Like
Yeah.
that can be fun, but that's not most people's idea of fun when playing limited.
Maybe this isn't the right way to phrase this idea, but do you feel like that's a concession in a way to pull the power down?
No, I don't think so. Or sorry, what do you mean by concession in this case?
Yeah, is it like are you doing something that you would prefer not to do for the sake of your group, or is that like
No, I don't think so. So I think that if you want to play more high powered, it makes sense to play it in constructed formats. And limited just is a better game when the cards are not the best cards that have ever been printed, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, I think it's a fair take. I can see where there's a variety. There's so many different tastes, of course.
Yeah. And I get my fix on that by playing those constructed formats. Like I run vintage tournaments here in Seattle.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to chat about that for a moment too. I know I was inspired to engage with vintage myself from somebody running local vintage events. Talk a little bit about that. How did you find your way into that, and what do you actually do with that?
Okay, so I used to live in Austin, Texas, and there's a pretty well-known group there called Romancing the Stones. And I
Yes,
think
yeah.
back in 2017 was the first time I played with them. They were running full proxy vintage tournaments, $10 buy-in at breweries like once a month. And this was sick. I had always liked playing Eternal formats, and I was very inspired by that series when I eventually moved up to Seattle and got back into Magic more seriously. I wanted to replicate that here because I know there are a lot of people in the area that are like legacy grinders and play Eternal weekends and whatnot. And I knew there was an audience for people to play vintage and just take somebody to step up and start organizing events. And reception has been really positive. People seem to really enjoy playing. We've done 3 events now over the past 6 months, and I always get asked when the next one is. So that's a great thing. As far as like actual logistics of the tournaments go, I have a friend who works in a brewery and they allow us to use their space. We just have to rent tables. So it's like pretty low cost and it's a very like stable and pretty welcoming environment. I don't love that it's in a brewery. It's not maybe the most comfortable for everybody, but it is a space where we have enough space to run a 30-person vintage tournament. So you do take those.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure comfort also tied to the level of how far you go into the proxy side of things.
Yes. So I think that if you're running an event like this, it makes no sense to do anything less than full proxy. Some events will try to do like 15 proxies or so on. I think that if you're trying to grow a community, it's just better to say use fake cards. It will get more people out, more people interested in the format, and the people who have the real ones are going to enjoy them anyway, right? Like
Yeah.
it does not detract from them at all.
I've certainly had experience in the proxy vintage space, and I think there is something to your point about how it makes it a safe way for people to engage. You know, you don't have to go buy your own time vault to participate. Like you can
Right,
just
and like
try it out.
nobody's gonna do that either.
Yeah,
Right? Like
exactly.
they're
Right.
gonna see, oh, I need a time vault to play vintage. Well, first of all, you don't, but second of all, you really don't because you should just proxy it.
Yeah, and if you decide you love it and that's something you want to invest your resources in, then you can consider, but how would you know until
Yeah,
you've put those cards on the table?
exactly. So every time we have people show up who have not played vintage before, and they typically have a good time. It can be a bit of a rude awakening, but it's just been a delight to run these tournaments and see people play a format that I love. And I've been telling people that it was originally a very selfish endeavor because I wanted to play vintage. And at this point, I feel like I got my fix and I just want to support a group of people doing a thing that they love every once in a while. So the cadence feels good. The events are fun. Typically, the prizes are 3D alters of like known vintage cards. So we've gotten Mystical Tutor, Red Elemental Blast, and Swords to Plowshares as first place prizes. Just 3D alters.
That's super cool. So like the multi-layer to make them deep, or like just an alter to make them appear three-dimensional.
Usually 5 cards glued together and cut out.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, they have been sick prizes, and it people seem quite interested in winning.
I will offer my own 2 cents, which I try to not do a lot of here, but vintage is one of those that I think people assume is all turn zero wins and incredibly spooky, high powered nonsense. And there's some percentage of that for sure. But most of the games I find are genuinely interesting, and there's a lot of choices to make, but all of them matter a whole lot.
Right. And I think it really compresses the game down into something that feels more like poker, which is fun. And I try to bring that sort of mindset to cube design projects also. So like Urza Saga decks sometimes just killing you on turn 3 or things like that. They're rare, but they do happen. They're in the possibility space and they're answerable by making the correct decisions, typically. And that's what I want out of a cube environment and a construct environment. That's what makes Magic interesting.
Well, you mentioned the inspiration of constructed in, like, particularly there's a Saga Cube, like kind of an homage that way. But you also have a lot of other creative projects.
I do.
I want to touch on a couple of them here, but kind of the first thought I want to ask is, where does all the inspiration for this come from?
Um, that's kind of hard to say. I think a lot of the environments that I've come up with have had this central conceit and sort of build out from there. So I have this like kernel of an idea that's almost like a joke usually, and then I take it to its logical conclusion. So like everybody gets an Urza Saga in their pool, or what if you built a desert cube, but instead of the lands being hard to get, your playables are hard to get, and that's what you have to fight over. Or like a Dan-Dan, where everything is an ancient tomb and the only creature is Wormcoil Engine. The kernel of the idea is this funny little bit, and then the whole cube sort of builds out from that.
Well, yeah, let's take our little bus tour here and maybe glance out the window at a couple of these. You mentioned like this most recent one. You mentioned your worm coil engine based Dan variant.
Yes. This is a joint project with a friend of mine, Danny. who was on your show recently to talk about Cogwork Librarian.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Cogwork Librarian is awesome, by the way. That's great.
Yes, it is awesome. Shout out. So the idea behind Wormworm is Ancient Tomb is an incredibly powerful land that is very busted, but it comes at a huge cost. So what would it look like if that was your primary mana source and you had to somehow navigate a game where your number of Ancient Tomb activations was limited? Or what happens when you get to a point where you have a huge amount of mana that you can no longer use? So it's this very bursty situation that turns into this real struggle at the end of the game when both players are at about 8 life.
Because
So,
you literally can't produce mana without dying in some cases.
well, okay, so there are 32 lands in my build, and 16 of those are Ancient Tombs. So there are ways to generate non-painful mana, but the most powerful way is to just use Ancient Tomb the exact correct number of times. Uh,
Heather, these are absolutely unhinged numbers, and I'm here for it.
I don't know, it seems normal to me. Um, so there are, I believe, 6 Wormcoil engines in an 80 card deck. And typically how the games play out is you fight over these like very abstract resources, like number of Ancient Tomb activations or like Briber's Purse or things like this. And typically the first person who plays a Wormcoil engine dies. Uh, it's like it can get appled, it could get copied with Phyrexian Metamorph or Mirage Mirror or any number of things. So it is very dangerous to put a Wormcoil engine into play.
For appled as a verb, you're talking about Ariad's charming apple, the game
Tempting
control.
Apple,
Oh,
yes.
tempting
So
apple.
that's a colorless act of treason.
Yeah, I love this card. It's so funny. Also, poisonous food.
It's also a poisonous food. So many games end in situations where you go down to 2 to cast a Wormcoil engine, and then your opponent just apples you to death. Either way, like they either take your worm or they kill you with the apple. And we've been calling it a prison mirror Dan-Dan experience.
Except it's a prison of your own design because you are also hurting yourself in the process.
Yes. So it's very similar in many ways to Urza Saga Cube in that you're playing everything to the board. There isn't much hidden information, and you're just trying to gain incremental advantage enough times that you can push through 6 damage once. And that's typically how the games go. Very sharp games.
And this is a list kind of like Dan that is just a single list of cards that you would shuffle up and play.
It's a single list of cards, you shuffle it together, and you have a shared library. So there are things like Candy Trail that ETB scries to, or Brainstone that you can use to
Yeah.
like mess with your opponent's draws. So there is a little bit of top deck manipulation, but it used to be way more in that direction, like with Sensei's top and things like that. But that just ended up being too repetitive.
That's fair. I also imagine pretty dire to pay 2 life to spin the top.
Oh, you are probably going to lose a game in which you do that. Like maybe 20 turns down the line, but like that could, you could certainly say you lost a game because you activated Ancient Tomb to spin top.
That's amazing.
I will say this is an environment that is still in active development. It leads to some very interesting games that are fun to play, but there are many fail states as well, or like stalemates that are not satisfying conclusions to a game, especially given the amount of time and thinking it takes to play one.
Sure. Yeah. Lifelink death touch threats that die into a lifelink and a death touch threat can make for strange math.
Oh, for sure. And there are certainly situations like Phyrexia's Core, where your opponent tries to apple your worm and you sack it to Phyrexia's Core, and now you have 2/3/3s, which are way harder to deal with than the one large worm.
These are the most wild sentences. I love it. I'm following you, but it's just so funny. Was all the like apple worm core like is that all intentional? Like all the
You mean
language
like
that
like the
Like you think about worms as like eating into apple cores.
That was not intentional, but we did discover that recently, and it was a pleasant surprise. We were just looking for colorless effects that were powerful and made sense, and it makes sense mechanically and aesthetically now, which is a wonderful thing.
It's nice when that overlaps. Kind of on the other end of, I don't know, accessibility maybe, you also have a little desert cube called Land Ho that I think is very cool.
Yes, Landho. Landho is a wonderful environment. It is a 360 card cube, and over 200 of those cards are lands, most of which are fixing lands.
Yeah, when most people think of a desert environment, they're thinking of these harsh, punishing, like decision dense, like everything you do has the potential to fail. And this sounds like it kind of goes the other way.
No, it is harsh and decision dense, and it is quite easy to fail, actually. So, there are a couple of things about this particular environment that I want to point out. The fixing is free, essentially. You have to be smart about like what you're going to wheel, because usually you're wheeling fixing here. So you have to read signals very carefully. But usually you can get your fixing and play like a 3 or 4 color deck, no problem. But it is the 3 by 15 draft. You get 45 cards, no basics, and you have to play 40 of them. So there's very little room for error as far as your drafting goes. And that has caused people some issues before. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most inviting environment or most accessible, just because you have to be really on top of your drafting.
Yeah, I think I probably just used that term incorrectly to say accessible. You have access to lands more than you would expect in a desert environment, but
Oh,
then
sure.
that's the rub, I guess.
Yeah. So it just means you have to be very particular about the playables that you're taking. And most of the cube is about trying to do some sort of lands based combo. And then once that fails, which it inevitably will, um, sort of attacking with the little itty bitty creatures that you have left over, or manlands, or something like that. So the games typically go very long, they're very slow, and it's very relevant what particular cards you have versus your opponents.
So it really is what you suggested earlier, kind of turning the desert paradigm on its head, where your threats are the important thing that you have to figure out and prioritize over in some ways over your fixing.
Exactly. So it feels less railroady than a lot of desert cubes I've played in the past, where often you will get fixing of a particular color early, and then you're sort of honed in on those colors, right? Your opponents are less likely to have those colors because you have the fixing, so lanes sort of open up for you. In this cube, you have to sort of make a bet on what colors you're going to be based on the playables that you open, and then make sure the fixing lines up with that.
That's so brain bendy. I'm kind of considering that now compared to many desert cubes I've drafted, and it feels like you'd have to turn your brain backwards to make it click the first time.
It's not as difficult as it sounds. There is a huge amount of fixing in the cube. So there are 9, I believe, copies of just dual lands. Not all true duels, but dual shocks, double fetches, snow duels, surveils, and manland in each of the colors. So you're going to get some duels typically, and usually some fetches to go with them. There are also bounce lands as well. It's a little tricky. There's a lot of removal in the format, land removal, so the bounce lands may not make it forever.
High risk, high reward.
High risk, high reward. There are interesting lands combos that you can do when you have the bounce lands, like Amulet of Vigor plus Summer Bloom, casting a Primeval Titan or so on. Like that, that classic chestnut exists in the cube.
I hear your constructed voice coming through again, Heather.
Yes, no, it's always present. Yeah, and there's some like oddball cards in here, like Price of Progress. Like probably shouldn't be here, but
Oh,
like
that sounds
they're there
brutal.
for story equity primarily.
There's sure a story there. Yeah.
One of the first times this cube was ever drafted, it was a 6 pod, and 2 of the matches were very long and interesting and intricate. And the other matchup was Fast Bond versus Price of Progress, and it was over in 5 minutes. And they had a great time. They went to 3 games.
That's amazing. The kind of tensions that you really wouldn't expect in like any other place. Shall we look at one more environment out the window as our bus blazes past?
Which one did you have in mind?
I was curious about Pilot Wings, if that's one you'd be willing to talk about.
Okay, this one is like this one's still very early in the design, and there's not a lot of information on it
We can go a
on
different direction
CubeCobra.
if you prefer.
No, no, no.
It piqued my curiosity, so I wanted
This
to
may
dive
not be
in.
the best for the podcast, but I can at least explain the idea for you.
Sure.
So I'm fascinated by the plane chase cards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at the Pilot Wings planes list, this is a list of 32 of the plane chase planes. And in particular, I wanted to build an environment where each player gets to build a deck that benefits from some amount of the planes, and you just have them as part of your pool. And when you start a game, you choose one of them face down, and it just starts in play. And essentially, each player has a plane that affects both players through all points.
You're kind of in a melded situation in the lore perspective. You're on both planes
Exactly.
at once.
And you can plane chase, and when you plane chase, you can swap to one of the other planes that you drafted. And since there are 32, you'll have 4 to choose from. So
Oh, interesting.
the idea is that you get to like counter pick planes based on like what your opponent is doing. For instance, there's a plane, the Hippodrome. All creatures get -5, -0. This is a great thing that you might want to have in play versus an aggro deck if you were a control deck, for instance. But you can counterpick the Hippodrome by playing the Great Forest. Each creature assigns combat damage equals to its toughness rather than its power. So I tried to choose planes that sort of have interlocking abilities that like counteract each other so that you can make interesting decisions about which plane you want to be on based on the board state.
So do you draft the planes themselves?
The idea was that you would do a Rochester draft at the beginning with half of the planes, and then do another Rochester draft at the end with the other half of the planes. So you pick up 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end, and then have a normal draft in between.
So this becomes a whole event.
It's a whole event. The cube is very early. It's been quite difficult to design, actually. Just the number of like combinations of planes that you have to think about and how it affects every card choice is quite a bit to deal with.
Especially with a face up part of the draft like a Rochester, right?
Exactly. Also, nobody knows what any of the planes do, so it would be quite a challenge for like a average drafter to draft this and like feel like they're making meaningful choices.
Some people in the cube community think of themselves as sickos, but it's like you got to be deep to know all
You
the
got to be, yeah. What
the
does
planes.
Gold Meadow do? Who knows?
There are 3 humans that know, and you must find them at the top of a mountain to
Yeah.
gain this knowledge. This is cool. I have a fondness for planes personally, so seeing any project that leans into it is heartwarming in a strange way.
Yeah, I don't know if this will ever see the light of day, but it was certainly an example of a little bit that turned into a huge, daunting project. And of course, it's named after the classic N64 game, Pilot Wings N64.
Yes, you certainly have many other projects as well. It's nice to know there's a lot to dive into as it goes. But do you find that there are consistent design or philosophy threads that connect through your projects? I know we've mentioned constructed sensibility.
Yeah, a friend of mine said recently that there are very few people in the cube space designing mean cubes, and that I have designed a lot of mean cubes that are interesting in ways that are maybe unique to me, which I find fascinating. So, like land destruction is very common, or just like very complicated interactions between cards. or just like power level going through the roof. Another environment I have Dat card. Everybody starts with a Bazaar Baghdad in play and a Squee Goblin Nabob in their graveyard. So that's not a particularly nice or inviting environment, but it leads to very fascinating games a lot of the time. And I'm very interested in exploring that space of like cards that many people don't feel like belong in Cube that I think they're good homes for.
What sounds like a takeaway is if you're going to be mean, at least be interesting about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Well, Heather, as you kind of think through so many of the things we've covered, what advice would you want to share with other people as they're designing and exploring their own projects?
I would say that it's important to have a vision of what you want your cube experience to be and to try your best to follow through on that. I don't know if that's good advice or not, but I feel like a lot of the projects that I have worked on have sort of had this like singular driving vision behind them, and it's been very important for me to like not compromise on that based on, I don't know, cards that shouldn't go in cubes or things like that, or things that seem too far outside of the normal power level of the cube, like things like Goblin Welder and Urza Saga cube. I think just having a clear vision of like what the experience of the cube is and like making sure that that comes across is an important thing.
Well, Heather, as we trend toward wrapping up here, I get to ask you one of my favorite questions, which is if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you pick and who would you have do the illustration?
I would like, in my fantasy land, a Dark Depths illustrated by Kaja Folio.
Love that.
I really like the lands that she has illustrated, like Mishra's Factory. I think a little snowy avatar monster under the ice would be quite fun from her.
I can already imagine like the whimsical rounded teeth and like bulbous eyes or whatever fanciful thing she would do.
Yeah, maybe some Christmas lights too.
That's a really good choice. I like that. Well, Heather, this has been a delightful ride through a whole bunch of really interesting ideas, encouraging for me, and I hope for you as well. If folks want to connect with you or follow up on some of the projects you're working on, maybe dive into their own knowledge of planes a little bit better, where should we point them?
I am on Discord, on the MTG Cube Talk Discord, as Frosty with 3 Ys. I'm not there often, but if you tag me there, I will likely respond. And I also have a Cube Cobra, which I imagine will be in the show notes.
Yes. All the projects I will do my very best to link. So, absolutely. Well, Heather, thank you again for taking the time to be here and to share so much of your passion and expertise here. This is a joy for me, and looking forward to more opportunities to connect in the future.
Thank you for having me.